And we will have some time for questions at the end. We usually leave about 10 minutes, David, if that's all right with you. And I will go ahead and pass the mic around. And if there are questions from our Zoom audience online, we will collect those and read those out for David to answer as well. So please welcome David Amott.
Then we can go ahead and start. My talk tonight, Too Important to Lose, Salt Lake County's early Assembly Hall buildings, will focus on basically a type of building, but highlight two buildings in particular. And I am going to explain why I'm highlighting these two buildings specifically tonight in a few minutes. But before I get to the meat of what we're going to discuss, I do want to acknowledge that this month, for another day at least, is National Preservation Month. And I do want to thank Murray First Foundation for giving me the opportunity to lecture for National Preservation Month. And I also want to thank Murray First Foundation and so many other organizations across the state that highlight, focus on, celebrate, champion historic preservation. A good friend of mine, Kim Duffy, is here, and she is the head of Holidays Historic Commissioner, CLG. And in a presentation that she gave on Fox News the other day, she asked the question, why is it that we preservationists do what we do? And I have my own answers for that, but it is a tremendous amount of work. It is blood, sweat, and tears. And I am so grateful that there are organizations from, of course, Historic Murray First Foundation to our government organizations, SHPO, State History, these nonprofits, and various smaller groups who are championing a single building, like the Gunnison Casino Star Theater, or the Community Church of Christ in Provo, or even your neighbor, or perhaps you, who fixed a historic wood window on your house, or repaired your front porch. All of these acts, big or small, are helping to maintain, help keep, preserve Utah's built heritage. And I am, as a preservationist, profoundly grateful for all of you who do what you do, and for being a part, for being accepted, for playing a role in Utah's preservation family. It really is true that preservation people are the best people. I do want to highlight specifically the work that Murray First Foundation is doing. If we had a few seconds, I'd actually would love to get an update on how their current advocacy is going in saving Murray's downtown. Murray has a downtown that other cities, even neighboring Holiday, can only replicate, right? In a half-baked way. I can't say too many things like that, otherwise I get in trouble. Anyway, Murray's is the real deal, right? And Holiday sort of pretends history, right? And of course, Historic Murray First, or Historic Murray Foundation is also working on saving the school that is currently the City Hall, but will shortly become vacant and available. So I wish you well with both those projects and the many other projects you are undertaking. So why is it that I'm a preservationist? Why is it that we are preservationists? I mean, there are so many reasons to be a preservationist, right? There are ecological reasons for being a preservationist. As they say, the greenest building is the one that's already built, right? There are economic incentives to being a preservationist through tax credits and other programs of that sort. Why I am a preservationist, though, at heart, what keeps me doing this work that sometimes drives me crazy, is that, you know, on a very fundamental level, I love stories. I love stories about people. I love stories about communities. I love stories about how communities form, how they evolve and grow and develop, and how the values of one generation give way to the values of another. And you can read all of that in old buildings, get a sense of the layers of community pride, of community effort, of community stories, of individual lives and collective efforts through these buildings. I happen to believe, and I am a resident of Provo for now, but I happen to believe that Provo would be much less of a community if the city had decided to tear down the Brigham Young Academy that now functions as the city's library. I think Provo would be fundamentally reduced as a community without that building. I also believe that Salt Lake City, if they decide to tear down West High, will be a reduced community. That this place with so many stories, a place where so many lives pass through, right? To have that touchstone eliminated would be a tragedy. And I believe that Murray is much less of a community because they decided to tear down their historic First Word Chapel. In fact, I drove past Vine Street today where that chapel once stood, and I couldn't help but see the ghost of this building. And I always get a little emotional when I think of what that building represented, right? And what it could still represent had it been saved. And I'll get a little bit more on that later on. I think that in today's day and age, we're all hungry for something that rooted, for something that speaks of community, for something that is local. I went to actually a community festival. What's it called? It's the Folklife. Well, it's the Folklife Festival, Living Traditions. Thank you. I have to depend on help from my audience. I was on 4 South, which is not a remarkable street in Salt Lake. Oh, well, that's good to know. That's good to know. 4 South. 4 South, for those of you less familiar with Salt Lake, is a street that has been basically plowed down and rebuilt in the last 10 years using podium buildings. But in one of those podium buildings was this restaurant called The Local. And it had just appeared. And I assume just by the name that you walk in there and I don't know, you order a sandwich, and through eating whatever you eat, sandwich, I don't know, a glass of beer, I don't know what else you might order there, you would get a sense of connection, right? And this desire for connection, I think, is potent, even, you know, on the corner of 4 South in a podium building, the sort of building that even the New York Times a few weeks ago published an article about, calling America the Bland, right? That this building could happen in Salt Lake, but it could also happen in Boise or, you know, Pawhuska, Oklahoma, or any other corner of the United States or world for that matter. And, you know, looking at The Local and understanding, unpacking a little bit of what that said in my mind, really made me appreciate places like the Bluebird. You know, you don't even have to be from Logan, right, to be proud of the Bluebird as a state institution, or the Idle Isle Cafe. If any of you, oh, you were the Bluebird? Oh, good. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh, you were the Idle Isle. It's one of my favorite restaurants. They actually just restored their facade. The Idle Isle is fantastic. Or even, you know, streets like Murray's Main Street, you know, which is State Street, but it's your main street, right? I really appreciate places like this, especially in comparison to streets like 4 South. So keep up the good fight. I'm now slowly going to get to my topic, and I'm going to get to my topic by telling you a little bit about myself and my own, the ways that my own love for preservation and architectural history find expression in my day-to-day life. I have a hard time sleeping. I'm very susceptible to stress. So there are times, and this drives my wife crazy. There are times at 3 a.m. I'm awake, you know, as if it was noon, and I simply can't go to bed. What I've learned to do, how I've learned to fill those hours is through Google Maps, take a trip to a city around the world. The other night I was in Jakarta, Indonesia. You know, a few weeks ago I was in St. Petersburg, Russia. It's fun. I mean, Google Maps is crazy because you can drop down in any corner of the world and, you know, take a trip, even at 3 a.m. in your bed, you know, in Provo, Utah. And what I've started to look for are buildings or bits and pieces of the built environment that indicate that that place is that place, right? That somehow this culture lives in this city, is responsible for this thing called community over centuries, built up this thing and created a sense of place, a unique sense of being, of existence, of I don't know, singularity from what was raw space, right? How is it that you transform raw space into place, right? A place with meaning. And of course, as I think about this in terms of Jakarta, Indonesia, and St. Petersburg, Russia, I think about this in terms of my own community, you know, even our own state. What buildings in Utah create our sense of place, create our sense of unique identity? And if this was the class I was teaching, I'd open it up to all of you for suggestions, but I probably should keep going so I don't run out of time. I have Googled this. I've Googled what buildings make, in this case, Salt Lake City unique, and here are a few options to pop up. I also remembered an acquaintance of mine, David Amott, wrote an article on the best Utah buildings, the best buildings that exist in the state. And this is all fine. What I'm really curious about are the buildings that are more sort of pedestrian, not one-offs like the state capitol. What do we experience when we drive down the street? And what do we see? And what sort of creates a sense of place, not just in one community, but throughout all of Utah? And I've asked a lot of my friends, what buildings do you think make Utah unique? One of my friends, Elizabeth Giroux, actually, who is a friend of a number of people in this room, said that she really particularly enjoyed the apartment buildings fronted by large columns. And she thought this was unique to Salt Lake. And I'm not sure that's true, but I haven't seen them in many other places when I think about it. Or our bungalows. Now, bungalows are all across the United States, but one thing that's fun about bungalows is that everywhere you go, they're a little bit different. You know, a Pasadena bungalow is not like the type of bungalow you would see in Sugar House, or what you'd see in Chicago as a bungalow is a little bit different than what you'd see, you know, in some other corner of the United States. So I do agree, our bungalows give us a unique sense of place. And then the tradition of adobes, right? I mean, the Southwest has an adobe tradition, but it's not quite like Utah's adobe tradition. Maybe you could find buildings made of adobes that look like those in Utah, you know, in other corners of the world. I just don't know that that's true. I think we do really have a unique adobe tradition. But, and I've thought a lot about this, and you're welcome to disagree with me, in terms of prominence, in terms of buildings you encounter in almost every community in Utah that lends flavor, I would have to say the number one building that informs Utah's uniqueness is the Mormon Chapel. I drive from essentially Salt Lake Valley to Utah Valley every day. And when I look out on the freeway, you know, I see tract homes, which I guess you could find in any corner of the world. But punctuating, you know, tract homes are these white steeples. And you're probably all afraid that I'm going to spend the next 45 minutes celebrating these chapels. And I'm not. I actually don't really like these buildings, architecturally speaking. I mean, they do serve a purpose. I especially think the steeple thing is interesting, and the church has put steeples on buildings that they shouldn't, for example, especially over the last 10 years. This is a chapel that is right behind, or was, now it's a school, was right behind the conference center, and it was built actually as a really beautiful modernist building. It's a little pixelated here on the screen, but about 5, 6, 7 years ago, they smacked that on, right? As a way to, you know, it's placemaking. It's a way to signal the church is there. I've actually thought a lot more about steeples than I probably should. And there's an equivalent here. There's a Pope, Sixtus V, in Rome, who really fell in love with Rome's obelisks that had been transported from Egypt to Rome in antiquity and then fell down. And he was busy, you know, putting these obelisks up, and he put these obelisks up in front of pilgrimage churches as wayfinding. You know, so you would look down the street, and anyone who's visited Rome has experienced this. You look down the street and you see one of these obelisks, you know that that is a pilgrimage church on this route, right? It's a way to infuse the community with religion, also as symbols of power, right? And that's, I think, what's going on with these steeples that are being plopped down on, especially churches where they don't belong. But rest assured, I'm not here to talk about these chapels, as ubiquitous as they are, and as much as I just argued that they give Utah communities uniqueness and flavor. It's not these chapels I want to celebrate. It's the buildings out of which these current modern chapels have come. And these buildings, I think, have a very rich history. A history that most of Utah has forgotten. And I'm doing my little effort here to remind people why they are valuable and why they need to be saved, especially in the case of these two churches, which are both threatened. I can talk a little bit more about that later on. I'm going to put the save button here. And I probably should explain a little bit why they're threatened. This one, after not being for sale for decades, generations of historic preservationists have tried to save this, but it's owned by one family who, up until the very present moment, has never put it on the market. They've never let anyone access this building. Well, a few weeks ago, it finally went on the market. I guess it's now been a few months with a hefty price tag, and it's being sold as a demo. It's being sold for the lot. It's a developer's dream, 0.15 acres owned RMF 35 on a quiet street. And when I saw this, my heart just fell through me down to the floor, because this is, in my opinion, a building that was just too valuable to lose. And that is what I'm going to try to convince you of. That's the reason why I'm standing up here, flapping my mouth, trying to convince you guys and try to recruit some help on this building. And then this other building here is a similar type of building. Again, it's one of these early assembly hall buildings, forebearers of several generations now of LDS chapels, and it's just down the street. This is on Murray Taylorsville Road, and it currently is a mosque for a wonderful congregation of Shia Muslims, most of whom are, recent immigrants. This is not being threatened because the people who currently occupy this building don't care about it. They simply do not have the funds to maintain it. Preservation Utah, myself, and a number of other volunteers, I think I did recruit Historic Murray First Foundation to help, because this was historically part of Murray, right? The over the river part of Murray, but still part of Murray. We're looking at grants and other things to try to save this, and these grants ultimately do have a fundraising component I can explain more towards the end of the talk. But this building, in my opinion, is another building that's too valuable to lose. This actually was my rebound chapel when they tore down the Murray First Chapel, and I needed a rebound. This is my rebound, because this appeared about 2 months on my radar. This appeared about 2 months after they tore down that chapel, and somehow, it got me through. And now I'm sharing the joy and the burden with all of the rest of you. Yeah, there's some grants, and I can talk more about that. Now, I do want to say something about religion. In Utah, religion is a tricky subject. I grew up in a bubble, in the Mormon bubble, and I didn't understand how people outside of my own sphere perceived religion, because I was sort of comfortable in this bubble I was living in. This bubble was burst especially when I got my job with Preservation Utah. I had many experiences where, in trying to save a historic chapel or this or that, people would open up to me and express their ideas and their viewpoints about the LDS Church. Oftentimes this happened on the tours that I would lead at the city county building, which is one of the activities that Preservation Utah does as sort of their regular offerings to the community. We take people on tours of the city county building. If you haven't ever gone on one of these tours, you really should. City county building is a fascinating building, and we take you through all the nooks and crannies, spaces you wouldn't otherwise be able to access. One of the spaces I always took people was the city council chamber, which is dominated by this giant portrait of Brigham Young. It was always interesting to talk about this portrait of Brigham Young to people I would say a good 33% of the people said nothing. Another 33% of the people I led on these tours would say, oh, look, the prophet, obviously, associating with the LDS faith. And another 33% would just let it loose and say, oh, I can't stand that guy and we should take him down. And, he doesn't belong here in this, society, this pluralistic society that we have now in Utah. And I would always say, especially to that last third, because I understood a lot of their frustrations they were expressing, not because of anything they felt particularly for Brigham Young, but, frustrations they felt with the current church and whatever it was doing in society. I said, I can't change necessarily how things are going to, I guess I can play my own little part, but how things are taking place now or in the future is really sort of out of my control, except what one human can do, right, in a large state. But the past really does belong to all of us. The past, when I went to school and studied history, for the longest time, I thought that history was a collection of facts, right, that you memorized and regurgitated on the test. But if you scratch down through history a little bit, just even a little bit, what you find is that history is actually a collection of stories woven together by various people with various points of view. And whoever's weaving together the story, really invents the history. But history is really that malleable. I was reading today that there are 2 new books on a topic that I thought you could not possibly write another book on because it had been so exhaustively, pursued by historians in past generations. So you look at Brigham Young and you see him as a figure from the past, you can really take that history, all the history he represents as a human or as a large movement or a group, and make it your own in your own particular way. And I think we already do this here in Utah. On the 24th of July, for example, you can march in a parade behind a covered wagon pulling a handcart, or you can go to Liberty Park for Pie and Beer Day, right? I mean, just a single example, right, of how ways big or small, no matter what your perspective is in the here and now, you can make this history your own. And the buildings I talk about today really do belong to all of us, especially, as I like to argue, because they play such a role in shaping a world, shaping a state, shaping a built environment that we still wake up in every day, we still move through. It is impacting us whether we are aware of that or not, that role of history in shaping it. The architectural equivalent of the 24th of July parade is the cabin in the park. Utahns love their cabins in a park. Here's one in Delta. Yeah, here's 4th of July. Here's the 24th of July. Here's the architectural equivalent. Cabin in Delta. An example in Midvale. Here's sort of the mother example of them all. The mothership of all historic cabins. The dual family cabin, which was once under this amazing temple on Temple Square. Now it's been moved out of its temple, and it's still on a podium, right, on the platform in between the genealogical library and the church history museum, right? So it's still in an elevated way and an elevated state, and it's this relic, right? So what I find so fascinating is we have cabins like this, which are absolutely adored, and we have other cabins like this, and this is more often what I see when I go to parks. This is the West Bountiful Dangle Wood cabin, which slowly rotted away to the point where the city ultimately had to transform the cabin into mulch. It was removed from the city. So whether you live in a city with a cabin inside a temple, or your cabin slowly turning to mulch, this is how we architecturally like to celebrate the pioneers. I have to confess, as a preservationist, as someone who worked at Preservation Utah, I really came to hate these cabins. Because so often I would approach a city manager or a member of the planning department and ask what their preservation efforts were, and they'd say, oh, we have this cabin in the park, right? That's where their preservation efforts would begin and end. So many cases. And I would also like to argue, as I thought about, well, actually, before I get to that question, I just want to clarify why I think cabins are so important to us. And again, if this was a class, I'd open up that question and ask, well, why does every city need its own cabin, right? But we don't have time, so you're just going to think about that. And I'm going to tell you what I think. I think there's a lot of romanticism, a lot of narrative, right? And when you think of pioneers, right, images out of Lara Ingalls Wilder, or these types of images, tough pioneers, right? Who live in cabins because they're tough people. They're going to conquer the West, right? The sort of romantic image that these cabins create. But more importantly, and I tend to think about this, especially in context of this cabin inside a temple, which is something actually we do a lot, or we did at least in America, but put pieces of nature inside temples like Plymouth Rock. There's Plymouth Rock inside its own temple. Or, my gosh, the 50 cabins that Lincoln was supposedly born in are all preserved. And this one actually got inside a temple. This cabin's particularly interesting because some of the logs that might make up this cabin could belong to the cabin that Jefferson Davis was born in. It's a real mixed bag here, as all these cabins are. I mean, all these cabins have been moved 50 times, and here's another example of raw nature, right? Put into a temple, right? The first tree monument, or the only tree monument, which fortunately for the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers was growing right in the median, so they could put a temple right where it wouldn't be in the way. But this idea of transforming nature into culture, right, is part and parcel of the pioneer narrative, right? Of taking something raw and cooking it and making it civilized, even Greco-Roman civilized, right? Of having a 0.0 or maybe 0.1 where we began, and then look around you, whether you're in Midvale or Sandy or Salt Lake, look at all the civilization, right? This is where we started. This was the seed, and look what we have done with that seed, right? It's such a ready-made narrative, right? But it's I would say, an inaccurate narrative. If you look at the history of these cabins, like for example, the Dual cabin, his name is actually not William, it was Osmond Dual. I mistyped that. It was his family's cabin, not, the whole civilization living in this cabin to get there. So it's a really small story that these cabins actually tell, even though they're meant to carry the weight of the whole, shebang. And the truth is, these pioneers could not wait to get out of these cabins. The Dual family lived in this cabin for less than 2 years. What I think is so interesting is whenever these cabins are found, and the latest cabin that I know was found and preserved on behalf of the city was one in Orem, typically they are ensconced in bigger and better houses, because that is what the pioneers wanted. Bigger and better houses. If you had to live in a log cabin, you weren't doing very well, right? You would want to upgrade to adobe. Gosh, once you got the adobe house, you'd want a wood house. And then if you got a wood house, well, strive towards a brick house. And if the brick was red and not yellow, so far the better. Have all of you seen those pioneer commercial buildings where the red brick, the really expensive fancy bricks on the facade, and if you look on the side, it's all that yellow brick, right? This red cherry brick was the true brick, right? These people couldn't help but get out of it. In fact, I have a painting in our kitchen that reminds me of that. I look at this every day. I mean, the narrative here is that the family started in this house, and then they added on, tried to make it work, and then finally they got wealthy enough to move, right? Whenever I wake up in the morning, I look at this painting, I think, okay, it's going to be a hard day. I'm starting in the cabin. Let's see what I can do to get to the house by the end of the day, right? Another problem with these cabins is that they don't encompass, especially in the Utah context, something that is so important. A piece of the narrative which is so critical, which is that of the gathering. The gathering and the regathering and the regathering and the regathering again. That rarely happened, if at all, in any of the cabins that are sitting in Utah parks, right? Here we have Wallace Stegner as the Gathering of Zion. And I think buildings that accommodated this gathering and regathering and regrouping of people are really able to tell us how our local environment was shaped, how our local environment was formed, right? How we went from a dusty pioneer town to whatever we are today, right? And that is where the meeting house is so important. What I like about the meeting house, the LDS meeting house, is it really wasn't invented until the Mormons got to Utah. And then it only came to be after several generations tried and picked and chewed at this building. Before the Mormons came to Utah, they were in various places, New York, in Ohio, in Missouri. They used whatever they had on hand to meet. Sometimes it was a cabin. Often it was a private house. While they were in Ohio and could make it work, they used the temple. And I think they also used the Nauvoo temple as a place to gather. And when I say gather, it wasn't just religious. They also had a school, for example, in Nauvoo temple. They taught children in that temple. They sometimes used forest clearings or fields. I was just reading an article that talked about how Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, Joseph Smith being the first founder of the LDS faith, he would oftentimes speak in a field in Nauvoo. And the problem with hearing Joseph Smith, that it would be acute whenever the wind blew and the leaves would rustle, or whenever the birds sang too loud, right? Or they used barns or whatever they had, rented spaces, whatever they had. So they really didn't understand, they didn't have a tradition of meeting houses until they started to work on it when they got here in Salt Lake, which was their first really long time permanent home, right? Salt Lake being that territory that no one else wanted, they got the leftovers and made it work. When they first got to Salt Lake, as many of you will know, again, the thesis of this community is gathering and regathering, right? Bringing people together, interacting, building faith, building community, in the process. When they first got to Salt Lake, one of the first buildings they constructed was a Bowery. And you all know what the Bowery was. It was basically this thing, a bunch of posts, supporting some branches. Was this going to satisfy them for long? No, right? I mean, nobody wants to be under a log when they can be under a plaster ceiling, right? Eventually they start creating what is the first Salt Lake Tabernacle, which surprisingly was a building accommodating, big enough to accommodate 2,500 people, which is huge for an adobe building. Yeah. I don't know how they were stuck to the rafters or something, but it was a big building. Another interesting thing, though, they did after they arrived in Salt Lake is they divided this big thing called Salt Lake City, Great Salt Lake City, into wards. And ward is a word that we associate, especially here in Utah, with the LDS faith, because of course the churches are called wards. But originally these wards were sections of the city. And this was not an uncommon term. Of course, New Orleans still has wards. But at that time, so did St. Louis, so did Louisville, so did so many other cities, right? So this idea of a ward was a basic administrative unit, right? But of course, in Salt Lake, what is administrative is also spiritual. It has so many other dimensions. These wards started with the first ward. So they started with the first ward in the southeast corner of the city, and then they moved all the way up to ultimately, the original 19 wards ended up here. You can see some of these wards are bigger because the land is so hard to live on, right? That would be kind of Capitol Hill. And I think the population was just smaller. But then they, it's expanded into the avenues. And these wards, well, they had the Bowery going, Tabernacle, Temple Square, they were also assigned to construct. Poor pioneers, they were always building something. Had so many things to build. What were they constructing in their individual wards as gathering points? Again, if this was class, I'd ask you to answer the question. As this isn't, I'll tell you what they were instructed to build were schools. Schools, if you think about schools, especially old time schools like this one in Spanish Fort, they're the perfect gathering building. I mean, when we think of schools today, we think of, a very specialized building, but of course, schools back then were not. They were basically just big buildings, open halls, right? During the day, they were used for schools, but during the nights, they would be used for different meetings at the church, different groups in the church. Anyway, give you an idea of what these schools were like. James Moyle, who actually plays a big role in Holiday's history. He grew up in the 15th Ward School. I brought in a picture of the 15th Ward, which is now the Art Castle, just to give you a sense of where this is. You can bet their school that they constructed in the 1850s, shortly after they arrived, did not look like this. It's a very simple building. I just brought that picture in to give you an idea of where we are in the city, right? In that western section. Jim Moyle went to school in the 15th Ward Meeting House. There were no slates, pencils, or even desks. The scholars sat on the same benches from which their parents listened on Sunday to sermons preached by men called from the congregation without previous notice. And the instruction of the day schools usually resembled these sermons. I think you probably have to send these students to summer school or matinee. I mean, I feel bad for the students in this context, but I also feel bad for the teachers. Can you imagine living in the 15th Ward and having someone knock on your door and say, it's your day to teach? Yeah, show up. I'm going to take you to the second ward now, which is one of these buildings I'm championing. Remember that building? Remember that little guy? That building that somehow we have to raise $450,000 for the Nights Out to save. Where this was built, where this was built, right across the street, directly across the street. So this is 7th South between 4th and 5th East, directly across the street. I have a picture. But here's the building today. See that guy right there? Directly across the street where these new townhomes are, they have this mud school. And it's interesting how they got the school built. I was able to find this notice in 1853 Deseret News. It says, the owners of the property in the second ward, a tax is levied for the payment of the schoolhouse, which must be immediately paid into the hands of trustees. So everyone was fined a fee, and then they put together this little adobe school, which actually by 1869 is doing much better than the 15th Ward School was doing. Wonderful description. The second Ward School has been in successful operation all the season under the conduct of Elder W.F. Critchlow, assisted by Miss Nancy Birch. These guys are pioneers in education. Think, what they had to teach with. Maybe they were lucky if they got a piece of chalk. Who has superintendents of the female department. The upper and lower rooms of the house are occupied, the former for the females and the latter for the males. The average attendance daily is about 120 in this tiny little thing. Exercises consist of reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and etc. The classes are well arranged and progress of the students is good. Way to go, second Ward School. Let's skip over these. Of course, it wasn't just school, but as I already suggested, this is a bit cut off, but I remember what I typed. This is a quote from a man named Handel Mace, who grew up in the second ward. During the winter, lyceums were opened in each ward, which afforded opportunity for the young as well as older members to be instructed in public speaking. Sometimes there were lectures, sometimes debates were held on various subjects, both religious and scientific. I took an active part in these activities. The question, are faith and belief the same, was suggested for one of the debates, and I was asked to oppose. Then they also had parties. They had parties for the benefit of the school. The house was filled to overflowing, and songs, recitations, and dialogues were credibly rendered. And then we also have some ecclesiastical matters. In this ward, for the second time in the church's history, the ward decided to adopt the United Order in 1874, which was a project that they probably hung on to for about a month. I don't think the United Order, especially the second go around, was terribly successful. It was in small towns, right? Orderville and other places, but Salt Lake, it didn't really take. What I hope you're getting by looking at these is the role that these buildings played in bringing people together for a variety of reasons. Each time you get together, you're forging trust, you're forging community, you're forging connection, you're forging understanding. A random group of people inhabited the second ward. A lot of them were from Sweden. A lot of them were from England, people from various cultures, grew up speaking various languages, but through this gathering and regathering, they're forging a ward, they're forging a community, they're forging a neighborhood. These buildings are absolutely essential to the development of Salt Lake. Oh, here's a I found so many different notices, things that were happening in these buildings. I just kept throwing them in. Picnic and social party. They had a party at the school. This is what caught my eye. Let's see. Everybody sang. Sweet singing added much to the interest and pleasure of the occasion, concluding with all are talking of Utah. I don't know what song that is. I've never heard it. It's probably lost, but if we can find it, let's all make that the state song. All are talking of Utah. It's got to be better than Utah. We love thee. So, what are you doing in Salt Lake? You arrive in, say, the 1840s or the 1850s. You're meeting in your schoolhouse for various, oftentimes cultural activities, sometimes religious, oftentimes culture. When you go to Sunday meetings, you are going to the Tabernacle. You're going to Temple Square. All this breaks down in 1872. The church fathers say there are just too many people. A lot of us are old, we're handicapped, we're not going to walk, right? From the first ward up to Temple Square, it's too far. We're just getting too big. So why don't we all just meet in our wards? And suddenly, all these different wards get another assignment: build a chapel. So what is now replacing these wards? Chapels. But of course, we don't really know what a chapel is. We still like our school. I'm sorry, what is replacing all these schools in these wards? It's these chapels. We don't really know what that is. We don't really know what to call them. So we do the best we can. And oftentimes what we do is we just replicate the school bigger and better. Oh, and by the way, I should note, to my knowledge, and I think I'm pretty sure, none of the original schools in any of the wards in Salt Lake exist today. Otherwise, I'd be fighting tooth and nail to save them. I think there are communities in Utah that maintain their original schools, but most communities, of course, the original schools are built out of adobe or other things that, you know, can easily give way to progress, right? Mainly what you have, the earliest buildings, the earliest communal buildings you have in Salt Lake, especially built by these wards, are the second generation of buildings. So yeah, one good effect will probably follow the present arrangement will be the erection of better meeting houses in some of the wards. So we start that. This is a particularly early example of one of these better wards that was actually built, according to research I've done, before the general church was ordered to build these things from 1863. And of course, it doesn't survive. But look what they call it. They call it not a chapel, not a ward, not a church. They call it an assembly hall. Because like the earlier schools, these are multi-purpose buildings, right? Here's the wonderful 10th ward. Ignore this. This hasn't happened yet. All of you see these are simple Greek revival buildings. Fortunately, this one still survives. This is one of two buildings, but these second generation, first generation chapels, second generation sort of communal buildings that survives. My favorite, and this is on 4 South. This is one of the treasures 4 South. This is why 4 South should continue to exist, even just a company. One of my favorite features is this plaque, which says 10th Ward Meeting House. Again, not chapel, it's a meeting house. And then it gives the date and the name of the bishop, which I think really shows the role that the bishop played as kind of the mini Brigham Young, you know, getting you organized in your own little ward, that he got his name on the communal chapel. This is just a spectacular building. This is the 17th Ward. Ignore this hasn't happened. And ignore the tower. Yeah, this actually should go over here. Ignore the tower. This, I think, was an addition to match it with the later chapel. But this is wonderful. These are, I think, the wealthier people in the city. So what they're able to do is build one floor for sort of more formal meetings and another floor for the school. In fact, you look here, there's writing. And what does that building say? What does it call itself? 17th School, 1874 District. So it's not even labeled a chapel or meeting hall or even assembly hall, it's still called a school, right? Because they're trying to figure out what to do, you know, what does the ward look like? And sadly, this was demolished. This made me cry the first time I learned about this building. It was demolished. So it's, you can't have a preservation lecture without a heartbreaking demolition photo. This was demolished in about 1976, 1977, and it was where that's right, 66. It was where that modernist chapel that I showed you, beginning with the ugly steeple that they put on. And yeah, oh, that's such a, look at this plaster. Oh my God. And just to give you a sense of what these other wards are doing, I mean, they're all very simple. We have the 14th Ward, 1872. What are people building in 1872, even in Salt Lake, right? What's going up? The Gardo House is being built about this time. High French Second Empire. I've got a rush. High French Second Empire. They're building what they can. They're building what they know how to do, right? It's basically the talents of this 3 by 3 block area, this 9 block area, and making it work. The inside, if I had more time, I'd talk about the inside. But again, nobody knows what an inside of a chapel is. I think it's interesting. There are no pictures of Christ, pictures of leadership, right? Same here. Okay, I'm going to skip along. I'm going to take you back to the 2nd Ward. Let me just keep this, just make another. I'm sorry. I over-prepared. I just love this stuff. I'm gonna chop. I'm gonna chop. Yeah. Here is another new meeting house. They're announcing the 2nd Ward. This is 1880, 1881. So it takes them a good 10 years to get on the ball with their meeting house, right? They've been using their school, cheating. The community really gathers together. An entertainment will be given at the 2nd Ward Schoolhouse by young men of the ward on Thursday and Saturday evenings. Admission 25 cents. Proceeds will be devoted to the new meeting house. I love this. So they start this process in 1881. They get off strong. Even the boys in the neighborhood are doing their part, right? And then things kind of peter out. Anyone who's been on a nonprofit board knows how this feels like. March, we discussed, and we're going to meet in September. And then this is the coup. I think I love this. This is now several years later. This was 1881. Several years later, the 2nd Ward Meeting House will be plastered just as soon as somebody comes along who is willing to work the building for blessings in heaven. Yeah. And then finally they get there. Here's the building's not dedicated to 1886, but here they celebrate the building, having a New Year's party. They describe the New Year's party, and they talk about all the food and how they even have baskets to send off to the poor, right, at the end. And then they say after dinner, like, so here's the baskets, and then follow the address by Bishop Peterson, remarks by Brother McGregor, songs, recitations, and music, all together making one of the most enjoyable occasions ever experienced by the poorest ward in the city. So they're, again, community. I think the biggest point I have to make tonight is that buildings like this simply don't exist in our world today. I do not have a relationship with the building I helped build, I maybe even skipped a meal for, that brings all my friends together, my neighbors. That building simply does not exist in our world, but it existed in theirs, and that's how they pulled together. The building was not incidental to their lives, it was central, and the act of building the building was critical to their lives. And we simply do not have that today, which is one of the reasons why buildings like this, to me, are so precious, because we will never have that again, at least probably not in my life, unless things go really south in the world, which who knows they will. Some of the other activities, they finally dedicate the meeting house. I love some of these things. Here's Judge Powers, who's some local official. He gives a lecture on the old-fashioned woman. Here's a debate on vaccination. General invitation, I mean, the more things change, the more they say the same, right? General invitation is extended to the public to attend a debate given by the Enterprise Debating Society in the Second Ward Assembly Hall, that building. The subject is resolved that vaccination should not be practiced. All of you who know Utah are know CCA Christensen, and this is one of the venues he used to show his panoramas of Utah history. Those of you who don't know what these panoramas are, they're huge campuses, immense campuses. They're now at BYU Museum of Art. And what they would do is they'd have them on the roller, and they would show a picture, tell a story, and then they'd keep rolling and show another picture. And it was the closest you could get in 1879 to a motion picture. And you can imagine how well received this was. So they went to the second ward. You see the life in this building? All the things that happened here, it's amazing. I gotta go on. You can tell already 1889, the space is getting limited. They're fighting over the rooms. The young women paid for a certain amount of rooms to be built, and now they want their space and they're not getting it, you know? And at this point in time too, I mean, what's happening in the background of so much of this is, you know, polygamy, Edmund Tucker Act, you know, there's so much strife. Time to move on. Now the third generation of meeting house. This is one of the earliest, the 19th Ward in 1890. I think it's so interesting. While this seems very exotic to us, it wouldn't to Victorianize. I think what the Mormons are now trying to do is fit in, and they're standardizing their meeting houses. I think it's interesting. This is the first building, at least I know of, that has the plaque outside that reads 19th Ward House of Worship. So they're specializing. Their buildings are becoming more specialized. 17th Ward. They move out of this and they build this very Protestant looking church right next door. Again, an attempt to fit in. I would love to know, there had to have been some local competition between these wards. You know, if you built a chapel without a stained glass window, would you be like the neighbors that didn't put up the Christmas lights or mow the lawn? I don't know. Here's the 10th Ward. So yeah, the 10th Ward, and then our little second ward. Again, you have the castle, the crenellation, the stained glass window. It's really quite identical to what the First Presbyterian Church is doing on South Temple, right? And they're becoming mainstream. And this Calvinist simplicity, right, that the church has maintained in at least their meeting house buildings up till now is being abandoned, you know, for many reasons, right? Industrial revolutions, products becoming more available. but also a desperate attempt to just fit in. And I think that's key beyond my mind, right? After the craziness at the end of the 19th century. I need to end, but here we have the same story. It's just in Taylorsville. This is the jewel of the building. This is 1890. Here, despite the fact that wards in Salt Lake and the more, you could say, established, neighborhoods, like the 19th ward, right? They're building houses of worship. And at the same time, these people are building their assembly halls. In fact, if this picture was set right, you can see the plaque right there says Taylorsville Assembly Hall. And here, as the religion continues to specialize in what is sacred and what is secular, what is cultural and what is religious, begin to separate, they find a need to build a cultural hall off to the side in 1910. And what a mess of a building. It's a beautiful mess, but it's a mess. You've got the Beaux-Arts door, and you've got some arts and crafts, and you've got some, I don't know, collegiate Gothic. I don't know what's going on here. That's wonderful. These are people who never took a day of architecture school, and yet they managed to get a building to stand up. That's pretty cool. And I think that's amazing. I'm cheering for them. And then a number of other wonderful things are happening. Politics. Even if you're not a member, you're still interacting with these buildings on some way, some profound way. Right. And then, of course, I do have to pay tribute to the Murray First Ward. First, the Murray First Ward through. If I can say one last word about the Murray First Ward, as much as I love the exterior of that building, as much as I love the chapel, my favorite feature, and I'm just so amazed when I found it, favorite feature of the Murray First Ward was a small projector room. Projector room they used to show motion pictures to people on weekends or perhaps during the weekdays. But that was such a wonderful sort of architectural space that sort of explained what role this building played in the life of Murray. It was it wasn't the only motion picture house, but it was one you could go to. I myself have never gone to a motion picture with, my friends and neighbors and all together in the same room. I imagine the picture is different, right? When you're surrounded by people, as opposed to strangers in some random, Cineplex. It was such a beautiful space. Anyway, through correlation and centralization of the church is a very centralized, we end up with this. But it's built on this rich history that I argue needs to be protected. So, I guess my last question is how are we going to do it? With this building, we have applied for funds through a national a national preservation organization. It's wonderful. And I'm praying that we get these funds. We have a good chance because they've never given to a mosque before, and this is now a mosque. But this other building simply has to be saved. It's just too important to lose. And with that, I'll open it up and invite you to join my team.